Hello, internet family. This is Anjanette Potter, and you also known as Adam's Rib, and you are tuning into um, Monday afternoon quarter, Monday afternoon quarterback. Um, so so over this weekend, I managed to go and see the Elvis movie, and I will tell you what. When I looked at this movie, the only thing could think of is somebody has been listening. Whoever wrote this script and whoever got this together must have been listening to Eclectic Music Geek podcast. And I say that, and I say that because just about every artist that I have ever did a podcast on was mentioned in this movie. So I personally recommend that if you're an Elvis fan, I think you should go see it. If you are, as I am discovering that I am, if you're a music history fan, like if you like to go and you like to look up stuff, you just are if you're a history buff, period. But if you definitely are a huge hit music history fan, I would recommend you go see it. It is a very good movie. The young man who portrayed Elvis did his research. He's gonna be one that I think y'all gonna have to look out for and he's done other work because I looked at Watch Mojo and different other channels that go and look up information on actors and let you know what other work that the person has done. Did a very good job. I tried to stay away from anything too movie specific because I like to go to movies and I like to have my own opinion. I hate to have somebody forbid me to go. Oh, it wasn't that good anyway, blah, 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 blah. I like to make up my own mind as to whether or not I would enjoy something. And I will be doing a review. I will be doing a commentary on it. Tom Hanks I'll tell you what. I can remember when the first time I seen Tom Hanks was on the sitcom Bosom Buddies, where he and another guy, Peter Scolari, I think it was, portrayed two guys who were looking for 80s sitcoms. Had some very interesting themes to them because it's like if two guys pulled that same stuff off in real life, would they get away with it, and secondly, if they would get arrested? Because it was just interesting the themes that they had for sitcoms back then. And so the sitcom that he was in, Bosom Buddies, I believe it was Bosom Buddies, he and another guy played by actor Peter Scolari, dressed up as these two guys who were trying to find a place to live, couldn't find a decent place to live, so they dressed up as women to check into and room at this one. I think it's like a boarding house or whatever that only took women. So they would show up as the women's brothers. It was just a very interesting concept. Now I look and I saw, and so Tom Hanks in the Elvis movie plays a man, Elvis's manager, Colonel Tom. Let me see here. Let me go on and just look. Let me. So let me look here. Colonel Tom Parker. So Colonel Tom Parker, so the movie was more Elvis than Tom Parker, but it basically was about their relationship. Because if you don't know, if you've heard stories about Tom Parker, and I'm going to discuss him in the podcast that I do reviewing this movie, he was a bit of a con artist. He was from Dutch American. He was a Dutch American. It said entrepreneur, but best known for being Elvis Presley's manager. He was born in the Netherlands, and he passed away 1997. So that my daughter was like 2 years old when he passed away. Managed to outlive Elvis, and he did. Tom Hanks did this, when he was talking about him, because he was the one narrating the picture, and he talked about him. He kept calling him our boy or my boy. And he said it with just the right amount of creepiness. So, it was really good. Like I said before, if you are a fan of rock and roll history, and when I was doing eclectic weekends, which means I was on every Friday night, I did a show on rock and roll. And like I said, whoever did it must have been listening to Eclectic Weekends, because it seemed like every person that I mentioned that was an early architect of rock and roll had at least a mention in the movie. So if you were going to have a complaint about the movie, probably the only complaint would have been not giving the characters more in-depthness, which I understand. You're doing a 3-hour movie, and you cannot do a complete biography on everyone that influenced his life. I also pulled up some articles, because I don't think a lot of people understand the nuances of rock and roll. Because by the time the 70s rolled around, rock and roll got completely whitewashed to a degree. So in the earliest stages of rock and roll, Elvis was a very controversial figure in the early stages of rock and roll. Like Aretha Franklin, if you knew anything about Aretha Franklin when she passed, people didn't realize, and there's been biopics done on her, she had a finger in the gospel world, because she first started, her first foray into music was through gospel. It was actually through her father's church. And so she had reach in the gospel world before she crossed over and began to do soul music. And Aretha was such a badass that she could pretty much touch it all, even opera. Okay, so we all think about the infamous, well, not infamous, but the famous, because there was nothing negative about this, her doing a opera, standing in for an opera singer that couldn't perform, one take, last minute notice. But when you are practiced and you're accomplished like she was able to go on that stage, do that performance, do that song on very little notice, and knock it out the park. So now we have Elvis. And so Elvis is instrumental in that he influenced a lot of early rockers. But Elvis was also influenced like I did the show on British Invasion. If it had not been for many of the people who were mentioned in Elvis's biopics such as Sister Rosetta Tharpe, um, Little Richard, B.B. King, Fats Domino. If you're a Happy Days fan, then you have heard a Fats Domino song. If you have watched any of these, if you were a Happy Days fan and you watched Happy Days, then you remember that the character Richie Cunningham was constantly singing a song about, I found my thrill. You're right. So that's Fats Domino. That is a Fats Domino song. So the 50s in rock and roll was very controversial because during the time there was still a lot of segregation. And it's funny because, they lied on Dr. King and talked about him saying that rock and roll was the ruination of our youth. He never said that. Whole lot of white Protestant parents worried about makes rock and roll encouraging race mixing, and worrying about, especially like the big tote on race relations seemed to be the fear of, blacks wanting to marry whites. And race mixing, period. So there's a lot of terms that I'm going to use in my podcast when I do it, and one of them is race records. So race records were basically records that were targeted toward African Americans. And so I thought it was interesting that they talked about, because I remember reading an article years ago in Right On Magazine, different black publications, where they talked about the fact that Elvis seemed to cop his style from a lot of African Americans that were doing blues, that were doing R&B, that were doing blues and soul music at that time. Now, Elvis had not only had a Southern gospel background, and that I think that was the one thing that was kind of left out of the movie was, because every so often Elvis would do a gospel album. Like a lot of people, like Aretha Franklin and different other people who were raised in church, he was raised Pentecostal, and I'm going to talk about that. Because of different teachings, many Pentecostals, I think at that time, were very strict. Many religious people, period, were very strict about the whole issue of performing what they call secular or worldly music. So that was a big issue with his family of origin. There was also the whole issue of they were poor. Now, in at that particular time, Elvis and his family would have been considered poor white trash. So his story is inspiring in that you can go from being poor, and that's one thing in this country that I thought I always think is interesting, is how many people have rags to riches stories. How a person can go from being poor. I would have said that, and this is not calling Eminem poor white trash, but he was pretty much the Eminem of his time period, and that most of the people he hung around with were black. Okay, now there's also ties to racism because of a remark that was attributed to him that nobody could really find that he actually said it, about black people only being good enough to shine his shoes or buy his records. Now, I kind of have a hard time believing that one, simply because most of his background singers were black. He had a lot of blacks that he hung around in his earlier years. The show also talks about, if you're going to be in music, you really got to watch who calls himself managing you. If you are going to do any aspect of the entertainment industry, you have to watch who manages you. Because under Colonel Tom Parker's mismanagement, Elvis wound up not being able to do a lot of what he wanted to do as far as touring. He was another example of a manager that I'm one of those people when I see people like this, because it also made me think of the TLC story. How, Peb was able to get them, out there. You know what I'm saying? Like under her, they were able to get out there, but also under her, they stayed broke, penniless. I don't know what it is with people liking to keep people broke. They sold all these records, but stayed broke. Had to file bankruptcy because they had no money. Different other stuff like this. And it's like you almost have to tell people who manage people, if you will keep your artists paid, if you will do right by your artists, you will not only have them a lot longer, but it also benefits you, because do you know how many people, when I think about Peb and I think about the fact that, do you know how many female artists it is that would love to be under another female because they sick and tired of the bullshit that they putting up with out of men? And I felt the same way with this Colonel Tom Parker. You would have had this artist, number one, alive a lot longer. Okay. Because when you work the artist to death, when you work the talent to death, you don't treat them right, and they don't go to rehab, because drugs was a big figure. You don't, get their health right. And, you're messing with your longevity. Not only that, if you are bad with that person and other artists see that you're bad with that person, they ain't coming over to you. Nobody wants to pay somebody a good 10 to 12% of their earnings to be abused. Like, I can do without the abuse. I'm sorry, I can't do it. But I am going to do a review this week, and I am going to talk about many of the things. Why is Elvis still relevant? When you talk about the rock and roll landscape, you pretty much can't talk about rock and roll without discussing Elvis, without discussing the Beatles. Why are they still relevant? Why is Elvis's estate still cashing checks? Why is it that you can hardly step over people doing covers without running into a cover of an Elvis song? And these are not bad things. Okay, I can remember when his daughter married Michael Jackson. And I remember the tabloids and different other newspapers discussing each of their net worth. This girl still was quite wealthy just from being an heir of Elvis alone. I think that once her and Michael Jackson divorced, because she was worth about as much as Michael Jackson, and Michael Jackson earnings were from him working. And she was still, I think Graceland still does tours. And Graceland is the place that he purchased his mother. He kind of set that rags to riches tone of buying your mama a house. Elvis was a really big mama's boy, if you didn't know. He really, doted on his mom a lot and everything. And the movie really didn't tell me anything that I didn't already know from previous works, because there have been many biopics on him. So he's still a very, there's renewed interest, but there's his ties to, I like the way that the movie discussed current events that were going on during the time of Elvis's prime years. The fact that Bobby Kennedy was shot, Martin Luther King was shot, the civil rights movement, everything that was going on, and how he and Colonel Tom Parker bumped heads because of Elvis wanting to let his music reflect what was going on and his feelings about it. And he wanted to be able to translate that message into his music. And Colonel Tom Parker, being, quote, the businessman, wanting him to do all this gimmicky stuff that didn't do nothing but make Elvis look silly. So it was a very good film. I recommend anybody go see it. I even recommend I recommend Black people go see it too. I I could have done I To me, many of the characters that were mentioned could have stood were probably worthy of studying and having biopics of their own. Um, it also kind of gives you a little bit of a reflection of the controversy that rock and roll was at the time that it was first coming in to fruition. Because, like I said, people thought Elvis was a Black person at first. Now, you would know that now because music has evolved. But at the time that people first heard him, there was controversial. And let me say this, the whole hypersexualizing Black people thing is very much alive in the origins of rock and roll, because rock and roll is a term for sexual intercourse. I had to drop me a strawberry. So the whole tendency to hypersexualize people of color is also an aspect of early rock and roll, because racism and race and sex as an intersect have been a big part of our existence in the United States, period, as Black people. First of all, there's the whole protecting white womanhood BS. There's also the whole issue of Black women being raped by white men. So race and sex have always kind of been, and during that particular time period, and like I said, I'm going to discuss it. During that particular time period, there was always the fear of whites and Blacks intermingling. So I'm going to talk about that during my review, because I don't want to keep on that particular subject. This past Friday night, I did the my celebration. I wouldn't say celebration, but my memorial to Michael Jackson. We had Michael Jackson weekend. I saw a lot of people who did posts that were talking about how much he meant to them. So we did that. I still have to put my show and my playlist, and that'll be available on Perfect Pitch. I'm looking at as I said, I'm still hearing commentary on the whole verses that I missed with Omarion and Lord, what is his name? Mario. And, of course, now there's allegations that Omarion didn't do all his own singing. And that I guess there's a common practice of recording artists, like they will do a demo. Like whenever I've heard of this happening with J-Lo or whatever. They're trying to shop a song to an artist. The songwriter has written the song and they've recorded, because when it's easier. I remember during Toni Braxton's early days, Babyface had written a song and he wanted to see if Anita Baker would record it. And so he sent the song to her, but it was Toni Braxton singing. And so she said, well, of course, because she had commitments, she couldn't do it. But she said, really, the young lady that's singing sounds really good. Imagine hearing that from somebody who you're a fan of. And they say, and you get an endorsement and they don't even know your name. And she said, why not have her recorded? She sounds really good. And I think it was one or two songs from the Boomerang soundtrack. And so, from what I'm told, they, I guess, must have presented the song to Omarion. He agreed to record it, but they didn't take the young man, and it was the young man from one of the singers from Troop. They didn't remove his vocals and had Omarion singing over top of his vocals. Which I'm like, why not just subtract the vocals off of there so you ain't got to worry about 20, 30 years into your career having to hear that mess. But that would be the recorders and everybody else. So now he had to hear about it later. Great. Okay, so I'm looking at, most of my news comes from Facebook. So in AP, the Supreme Court's abortion ruling sets off new court fights. So I saw where someone bombed one of the places where, and I can remember volunteering for some of these places. Someone bombed one of the places. They're not abortion places, of course, because these would be pro-abortion people doing this. These are the places that people come and they get free ultrasounds and get pre-pregnancy testing. And what they're there for is to counteract women getting abortions. So they have all kinds of services available. The one I volunteered for, they had, host homes, they had baby layettes, they had services community services that they could put the woman in touch with, so that they, basically services that are meant to make it easier for you to keep your baby. And one of them got bombed. One of my favorite scriptures is, and be not your oppressor and choose none of his ways. It's very hard. For that, even though I don't like the thought of those places being bombed. But, and this is going to be a little bit of meat here, I understand how some of those people feel, because I think that Christians should have been a little more active in teaching other Christians not to bomb abortion clinics. So it was a little bit of what I call retaliation. Because you cannot use your spiritual beliefs to commit crimes. And then, violence is never the answer. And so when the abortion clinics have to worry about being bombed by folks who proclaim to love the Lord, even though bombing an abortion clinic kind of counteracts the pro-life message, because how do you say pro-life but think it's okay to endanger lives and endanger the lives of women who are in these clinics? Now, I don't completely throw away the message of the abortion protester, because an abortion protester is how I wound up saved. Because the person, let me know God loves you and your baby. They were not bombing. They were just outside handing women information to keep them from going inside and, getting an abortion. Now, it didn't stop anything because I still wound up going through with the procedure. But it left a lingering on my mind so that the next time I found myself in an unplanned pregnancy, I wound up not aborting. So I do have experience in this area. And I can remember telling young women during my Yes All Women days, even though I don't believe in aborting, I do believe in birth control. And so I guess for many, they would call me on the fence. And I'm perfectly okay because I don't believe in people forcing people to make decisions. I'm going to go ahead and shut this off and come back because I have a little trip I need